all-star cast to discuss some important issues that I think we've been following, all of us have been following for the past couple of months. So our event tonight is called Faith and Border Ethics, Immigration and Human Dignity in Trump's America. What I thought we'd do, I thought that the way we would play this tonight is we're going to have a conversation among ourselves here for about 30 minutes. And then I know, my experience has always been that the questions from the audience are at least as interesting as any questions I might pose. So then we'll open it up to you. So you might be formulating questions, or you may have already arrived here with questions. So please, ask away. We do what we're doing. You're here, and we're delighted to have you as part of the conversation. To my immediate left is Professor Peter Skerry, who's a professor of political science here at Boston College. He is as well senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, with a research focus on social policy, racial and ethnic politics, and immigration. His most recent book is Counting on the Consensus, ? Race, Group Identity, and the Evasion of Politics. Peter's current project is a study of the social, cultural, and political integration of Muslims and Arabs into the United States. To his left is Professor Dan Kantstroom, who's the Thomas Carney Distinguished Professor of Law at the Boston College Law School. He is as well, just recently I gathered, the director of the Rappaport Center for Law and Public Policy, as well as the director of the International Human Rights Program. He is as well an associate director of the Boston College Center for Human Rights and International Justice. Dan's most recent book is Aftermath, Deportation Law and the New American Diaspora. To Dan's left is Professor Kristin, who's a professor of theology here at Boston College, where she teaches on Christian ethics, specifically social ethics, migration ethics, and moral agency. Kristin's books include Kinship Across Borders, A Christian Ethic of Immigration, and Prophetic and Public, The Social Witness of U.S. Catholicism, which is a book that won the College Theology Society's Best Book Award. To her left is Professor Hosffman Ospino, who is Associate Professor of Hispanic Ministry and Religious Education at the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry. In 2016, he was co-principal investigator for the National Survey of Catholic Schools Serving Hispanic Families, the first ever study of its kind. And one of Hosffman's most recent publications is Hispanic Ministry in the 21st Century, Urgent Matters. So I think you will agree with me, we have a good cast of characters to address this. So let me begin by just throwing out some questions to this group, and you can come in. There's no order here, so please come in, or if you want to reframe the question, reframe the question. These are not deathless prose, okay? I guess my first question is, do you think that nations need borders? That seems to have been the presupposition of U.S. lawmakers, in the recent past. And if you do think that nations need borders, how should nations defend their borders? How porous or non-porous can borders be?
Well, I'll start. I think one can certainly make a strong ethical, moral, philosophical argument that borders are arbitrary constructs that are designed to shield inequalities, to instantiate racial polities, to do a number of negative things. I personally, as one who has devoted his life actually to working with some of the distortions of immigration policy, particularly in this country, I'm often pressed towards an open borders position. I'll just begin by saying that I actually don't accept that position. I personally feel that the nation state, for all of its faults, and the faults are many, and I think we can discuss what they are, is probably the best way of organizing large numbers of people, or maybe the least bad way when compared to what the alternatives would look like. Michael Walzer once warned about 1,000 petty fortresses. One can think about, if you didn't have a civic conception of a nation state that has evolved over time since the 17th century, people would organize themselves according to other metrics that would not be neutral in that sense, or would not be civic in that sense, and I think those things would be worse. Having said that, and I'll only speak briefly about it now because I think the idea here is to have a discussion. What strikes me as interesting about borders and problematic about borders is that the border is the place where the most interesting contradiction occurs, and that is the contradiction between people who, by the very definition, are at the lowest ebb of their personal power vis-a-vis the legal system and the political system of a particular entity, that is to say non-citizens, or in some cases refugees. They're at the weakest possible state because they don't have citizenship rights, they have no right even to enter. And they face a confrontation at the border between the state, the power of the state, at its absolute strongest version, which is the sovereign power to control that border. And this, I think, is a very profound moment, and that's why this is an always interesting and always dynamic conversation, because at that point one has to ask, what is the source of legitimacy for a person's claim to be treated with dignity, to be treated with respect, to have basic rights protected? What is the source of that claim? If it's not going to be the positive law of the nation state, what is it? I think there is a source for that. I'd like to discuss it more. I think law has worked very hard, international law in particular, to come up with some answers to that question. But again, I'll just begin by saying, I think the basic answer to your question is yes, I do think borders are necessary and complicated.
Just to jump on, to turn on my mic. Okay, does that, I don't know where Jack went. Thanks to Mark and Jack and Susie. Is that on? Just to jump on to Dan's opening remarks, I agree that we continue to need porous, not open borders, even as I think the role of borders is really being reshaped today by global trade or the movement of capital in markets, by even international human rights organizations. But I do think considering sovereignty to be legitimate but not legitimized by the state, and considering it not to be absolute, is important, especially in terms of our topic for tonight. I think it's possible to say we're opposed to open borders, but that we can treat those seeking asylum with basic respect. And to have, to your second questions, to have de facto death-dealing forms of fortification, I think disrespects the claims of folks who tend to be the locus, those undocumented immigrants or irregular immigrants at the borders. Even if we have a kind of a hyper absence of sovereignty with transnational networks of terrorists or with global trade, we have a hyper presence with the militarization of borders kind of happens on their heads.
So the basic answer would be, you would agree, yes, they're necessary with certain restrictions attached to them, understanding.
Right, relative sovereignty.
I think if I can follow up on this, I think that your question, Mark, first of all, thank you for the invitation. I think that your question begs also for some historical analysis as to how borders are created, and perhaps the one border that perhaps that causes more controversy in the United States of America is the Mexican-American border, But it's interesting to see that, I always joke with my students that, in 1848, hundreds of thousands of Mexicans went to bed as Mexicans and the following day woke up as Americans, because they did not cross the border, but the border crossed them, So the circumstances in which borders are created somehow nuance the rigidity in which we understand them, I have friends who live in El Paso, for instance, who 40, 50 years ago would go from El Paso into Ciudad Juarez and back and forth, and there was no physical border, families were there without a problem, they would go back and forth, and it is until somehow the United States of America developed this idea of the rigid physical border, that separated families, separated cultures, and so forth, you know. So the question for us is to imagine how do we take history into consideration? And one more anecdote, you know, for instance, earlier in the, you know, I mean, in the history of the U.S. Mexican-American border, you know, one of the factors that demarcated the border was the Rio Grande, you know. But what's interesting is that there were moments when there were droughts, you know, and the Rio Grande would just dry up, you know, and then there would be rains, and the river would move in a different direction. So some people who, you know, were not citizens of the U.S. by the river, you know, ended up being citizens of the United States for a number of months, you know, and then the following months they would be citizens of Mexico. So I think that in a sense that's a jovial way of, you know, looking at how nature itself, you know, kind of defies the idea of physical rigid borders.
Right, but when, as you all know him, Bert Garza, who was the previous provost here, who is from Texas, and he's from a Mexican-American family. And when I first met him, I said, so Bert, when did your family come to the United States? He said, before it was the United States.
That's right.
My family lived in Texas before it was the United States. Peter, you want-
Yeah, well, I guess I have a somewhat more positive view of borders than I've heard thus far. Whenever I get involved in these kinds of discussions, what comes to my mind is when President Obama got elected, and his first priority was to pass some form of healthcare reform. And how did he do that during the campaign? And how did he do it once he was in office? Well, he argued rather explicitly at the time, if you recall, that he was pushing for adequate health care for all Americans. He didn't argue adequate health care for all Americans and Mexicans. He didn't argue for adequate health care for all human beings. He argued for adequate health care for members of this political community. And while members of this political community aren't exclusively and narrowly defined by our borders are an important part of that definition of the community. So that was my first point. My second point would be that I was going to take issue with Dan's characterization, at least in part, of how when at the border, the individual is faced with the state. He didn't use the term apparatus, but I think it's a fair term to use. Knowing Dan, he'll correct me if I'm wrong. That the state apparatus.
Peace be upon you.
One of those moments avoided, thank God.
So the state apparatus is there in all its intensity, but gee, I'm not at all persuaded by that. The other story you heard about, the border was there, wasn't there, moved back and forth, became more of a border later. Immediately, I think, throws into question that view that state sovereignty is necessarily there in force. It can be, it's certainly there in force now, but it hasn't always been, and that suggests to me a level of complexity that I'm not sure I was hearing. But I guess the point I'll end on is that I spent a lot of time at the border. I spent a lot of time at the border with Border Patrol agents. And something I was always impressed by, and I'm struck by it today, because I think Border Patrol agents have a lot to do with the Trump administration's policies and vice versa. There's a kind of perverse love fest that's going on there that none of us are benefiting from very greatly. Least of all people from south of the border. But the fact is that if you spend time talking to Border Patrol agents, they will tell you two things. And I spent a lot of time with a lot of them, and invariably they volunteered. One, there were federal law enforcement agents, and we carried guns. And that's not because they're gun happy, although there's some of them who might be gun happy. It's because that's their status bureaucratically for pay and for status in the federal law enforcement hierarchy, and that's important to them. And it's important to them because they're in a very strange and not very well respected kind of law enforcement, which is to say that every Border Patrol agent I ever spend time with, and I spend lots of times through lots of late nights sitting in the van waiting for people to sneak across the border, and invariably the agents would always reassure me that, you know what, if I were in their shoes, I'd be doing the same thing. I'd be trying to come across that border and better myself for my kids and my family. And that tells you this is a very strange kind of law enforcement. You don't find cops on the beat saying, you know what, if I was in that guy's shoes, I'd be robbing banks, I'd be dealing drugs. These guys in this kind of law enforcement know that they're in a strange kind of legal area where they're not apprehending criminals, but they're apprehending people who might be criminals, and they know that they haven't got a lot of oomph behind them when push comes to shove. They do right now because they've got an alliance going on with Trump in a very strong and direct way. But it's a very strange kind of law enforcement that causes me to question Dan's understanding that the full force of our sovereignty is there and present at the border.
Yeah, just since he's thrown out the D word a couple of times.
You being Dan?
I want to say one thing about Obama, one thing about the Border Patrol, and one thing about Trump. Regarding Obama, what I think is interesting is, of course, what Peter says is true about the politics of healthcare. But I think we should think about something that Obama did not say and never would say, nor would you say, I'm sure, which is that non-citizens who are not entitled to health care, if they get sick or injured, should die. Nobody ever said that. And this is what I meant by the struggle here is to figure out what is the core of the fundamental human right that is transcendent in this situation. I didn't actually agree with Obama about health care, but I'm just saying the two questions can be distinguished. Regarding the Border Patrol, I spent a little time with Border Patrol agents. I probably haven't had as many beers as maybe you did with them, but I've watched their work. I've also spent a lot of time with non-citizens in Mexico, in Guatemala, thinking about the dreadful passage north and what they had to overcome to get there. One thing I never heard any of them say was that if I were on the other side of the border, I would be a Border Patrol agent. And it just struck me as you were speaking that there's an interesting dissonance here between those who are projecting power or who are implementing sovereignty versus those who are fleeing for their lives. So it's an asymmetrical problem in that sense.
So your argument then would be something along that, correct me again, it's like there are certain human rights that transcend sort of national constitution.
Absolutely.
And the right to a safe life is one of those rights.
Yeah, well, let me say the third thing I wanted to say, and then I want to come back to that, because I don't think, I mean, I teach human rights law, and there is no right to a safe life. There is a right to dignity, there are certain other rights that we could tease out, but I wouldn't frame it exactly that way. That, I think, would be a little too broad. Of course, under the positive canon of human rights law, there is no right to enter a nation state. There is a right to leave a nation state, but there is no right to enter a nation state, although there is a right if you're a refugee or fit within certain categories to have it protected. I just want to say the last thing about, it's a quibble actually with you and the title here, which used the phrase, Trump's America. So I'm not ready to acquiesce in the proposition that this is Trump's America yet. I think this is a temporary phenomenon, but I do think that...
I would sign that.
I think you would. But for immigration policy, it's quite interesting because I think there are many people in immigration law who think that there has been this sort of radical shift in policy in the Trump administration. In some ways there has been. In some ways there's a real harshness, there's a real unleashing of certain very visceral negative tendencies. There have been some actions that I think are completely beyond the pale, separating babies from their mothers, for example. But in other ways, if we talk more about it, I view the Trump administration, and this is where Peter and I will definitely differ, as the culmination, the sort of apotheosis of certain trends that have been present in this country for the last 40 years or so. And I think some of those trends have been deeply negative, and they have been justified in language of protecting the border and protecting the rule of law, protecting the citizens, all national security justifications. I think we are now reaping the harvest of some uncritical acceptance of some very negative steps. And I do say that to Peter with respect, and I know that this is the crux of our disagreement. I do think it's something about which reasonable minds can differ. As I said, I do believe in the nation state. I think that protecting a certain measure of community and culture is important. I obviously teach law. I think the rule of law is important. But still, I think where we are now, I've been representing people in immigration proceedings for almost 30 years now. I've never seen anything as bad as what we're facing now. And so it's a very profound question to ask, how did it come to this? Because where we are is very bad.
I'm going to offer Kristin and Hosffman, do you want to?
On Trump's America or on, yeah.
Or anything that's gone on, any conversation that's happened so.
I think Trump has tapped, I would agree with him that Trump has tapped into some trends we see in how we frame immigration in this country that did not start with his declaration to run, where he talked about all Mexicans being rapists. I think he has, his rhetoric has certainly given cover to less dog whistle rhetoric and more explicit damaging rhetoric. I do think some of his policy changes, if we think about giving more latitude to who gets deported. Obama did that as well at first, but then he had narrowed to those who had committed crimes. I think we've gone backward in that. If we look at his slashing of refugee caps, if we look at rolling back TPS, I think he has been able to enact some of his agenda in ways that is really harmful directly. I think others of his grand agenda haven't had appropriations from Congress and we don't have a wall throughout where Hosffman was just describing the southwestern border as he promised at the outset. But I do think we have a deep history in this country of using, as you said, rule of law or national security language as a cover and for treating immigrants in terms more of economic functionalism or really weighing social costs rather than dressing it up in national ideals of hospitality and liberty. I don't think that is new. I would agree with you there. I think the way in which he was able to play on those trends and cast immigrants as not only economic threats, which of course we've seen, especially every time our economy dips, that's been a convenient and effective scapegoat, but also capitalize on anxieties about changing demographics in our nation and our culture to conflate security threat, economic threat with really national identity threat, I think in a particular way that capitalized on some nostalgia, on some real and perceived senses of loss that has had an effect. So I would agree that it's not new, but I would also agree I would also say both in policy and rhetoric, he's had harmful impact in a short period of time.
Hosffman, do you want to?
Just briefly, not much to add to the conversation. Actually, I'm interested in Peter's response to them, but what this conversation brings to my mind is that, in the process of defining what a nation state is and, the rigidity of borders, the flexibility of borders and so forth, one of the questions that emerges, particularly in today's context, is the definition of who becomes a citizen, and who's considered a citizen. And by being a citizen, who gets access to the rights and to the benefits that a particular nation raises. I'm thinking of so many Latinos who've been in this country for 10, 20, 30 years, and without the possibility of becoming citizens, DACA students who are living in a limbo and so forth, even TPS, as you were mentioning. So I just wanted to put that on the table as well.
Peter, did you want to respond?
Yeah, sure. I want to go back a bit to a point that Dan made about this never having met somebody coming up through Mexico, approaching the border and putting themselves in the place of the Border Patrol guard. I don't doubt that. I can't imagine that you would strain human credulity to have such empathy if you just traveled 3,000 miles through Mexico to think that way. But it does cause me to think, which I know Dan knows. I'm not suggesting he didn't say it, but it just leads me to immediately think that a good half of all Border Patrol agents are Hispanic, more specifically Mexican. And for reasons that I'm not quite sure I completely understand it, it's also true that they, in my experience and others have noticed this, they tend to be the harshest agents on the line, as if they're trying to prove something, I guess. But it isn't all that improbable, the proposition he puts forward, because when people come here, they often wind up in those jobs. Obviously, not all Hispanics do, not all Mexicans do, but the job is seen as so alien to them once they're here. But more to the point, this focus on the border is obviously important. That's why we're here. That's what Trump is making a big play with. But I mean, I agree that this is the culmination of 30, 40 years of very unhappy, not very ennobling history. But I think the history is complicated. We're focused on the border, and Trump has got people focused on the border. Well, I mean, that's been a useful ploy for politicians on all sides of the aisle for these 30, 40 years. Instead of getting serious about penalizing employers who get away with hiring undocumented workers because we have a laughable system to police that, we're all worried and focused on the border, and that's why Donald Trump is, sort of running with that. He knows an easy mark when he sees it, and he's playing it to full advantage. If he were serious, if Republicans were serious, if Democrats were serious, and they're not as serious about controlling undocumented immigration, that's their problem. They can figure that out. But if we're serious about controlling undocumented immigration, we'd be serious about penalizing employers who hire undocumented immigrants, and we're not serious about it. So, the border is so daunting and so all-consuming, but the border is sort of like, the house next door where the guy working on the lawn is undocumented. It's right next to us, and we're not doing anything about it. And to me, that's just as telling as our discussion about the border.
Okay, good. Let's move to what I'm calling the Jerry Springer moment in our conversation.
Actually,
Oh my goodness.
I just want to confirm one
Is
thing.
Dan going to take something off?
Before we get to that, actually, let's not get to that. But what I was going to say was that the point that Peter made is actually a very important one, because one of the things that I meant to say, I had thought to say when you asked about borders, is that we tend to think of borders in sort of, terms of cartography as lines in the sand. But first of all, they're historically contingent, they're physically contingent, and more than that, people carry the border within them. I mean, the idea of the border is deeply related to the idea of citizenship and to the idea of legal status. So there's a lot of very interesting writing about this in a very theoretical vein, but I think it's true that we can become, the border can be sort of fetishized as it is that locus, but it's certainly not the only one. We can talk about the policy of employer sanctions later. I think that's an important question.
So I guess the question, the next logical question is it ethical to deny people entrance at borders? Or probably a more realistic question would be, under what circumstances is it ethical to deny people entrance into a sovereign nation at the border? Now, there's been a lot written about the distinction between immigrants and refugees and all that sort of stuff. Do you think that's pertinent or not? But you could jump in anywhere there. So, you want to start on that end?
Absolutely. Well, it's certainly, I mean, having this conversation with a lawyer and a political scientist, you know, puts me in a little bit of a disadvantage. But what I'm thinking,
You might have recourse to higher authority.
I don't
And also,
Don't be too modest. Disadvantage.
well, Kristin, like Hebrew national answers to a higher authority.
so if I can twist your question a little bit, Mark, you know, I think that I'm not gonna focus much on the ethics of, you know, crossing borders and so forth, but what I wanna highlight in this conversation is, you know, what are some of the ethical questions that emerge when we welcome certain populations and unwelcome a few others, you know? And I think that this is what, and this is a conversation that is taking place not only in the United States of America, but also all throughout Europe, you know? There's this philosopher from Spain, Spanish philosopher Adela Cortina, who coined the term aporophobia, which is a fascinating term, you know. And what she pretty much says is that most nations throughout the world, especially most first world nations, developed nations, wealthy nations, are willing, ready to welcome the wealthy, the famous, you know, those who are educated and so forth, brain drain, we're all for it, you know. But the challenge is that we put all sorts of restrictions and impediments on those who are poor or people of color or the people who are not desired or desirable in a particular society. And actually in our US society, I mean, we recently had an example precisely of that, you know, when, you know, the president, you know, pretty much, you know, is reported to have said that he would rather have people from certain countries and not certain countries, you know. So I think that the ethical point for us, you know, in this in the conversation is, how do we see, I mean, to what extent do we separate, you know, humanity from those who are desirable and those who are not desirable? And then what's our responsibility, particularly speaking from as a theologian, as Christian women and men, you know, or as people of faith, what's our responsibility towards those who are most vulnerable and struggling, you know? Should we welcome them? I mean, the question of refugees certainly comes to mind.
I would say, in terms of your first question about these category distinctions, I kind of like the open borders. I'm not ready to dissolve distinctions between migrants, economic migrants and refugees, but I do think there's some helpful developments in terms of talking about people as forced migrants, crisis migrants. Alexander Betts has coined this term survival migrants. I think that better captures people on the move. So refugee category doesn't account for climate refugees, for instance, and yet, you know, if it's dangerously rising waters or a hurricane or a landslide, that may be as credible a threat, right, as a threat of violence would be. So I think it's helpful to refine our categories in terms of dire situations in which people's dignity is being violated, without saying, I still would like to preserve a distinction between the folks who want a relatively better standard of living and people really fleeing. I think for me, some of the ethical issues, like the summer or the crisis at the border arise actually from what Peter and Dan were just saying is one, this tendency to focus on symptoms rather than causes. So the wall is maybe hopeful in rallies or symbolic in ways that's evocative, and yet I think it diverts attention from some of the root causes and even complicity beyond employers willing to hire folks who are undocumented. But the guy next door that you said has someone mowing their lawn, right? Our willingness as consumers to underpay for goods and services. Because I do think history, you mentioned earlier, often gets eclipsed. We're pretty good at amnesia in this country when it comes to immigration. There's not a lot of talk about US foreign policy or US trade policy and its role in generating some of the migrant flows that we've seen. So I think for me, focusing not on crisis management all the time, and I think there's ethical issues in there, of course, the inhumane treatment of separating children from their parents. Anyone who's listened to the audio from this summer, I think it's pretty important to say, who are we as a nation? I don't think you have to appeal to Christian family ethics or human dignity in a religious sense to say, aren't we better than separating children from parents, especially under false pretenses, especially now, thanks to the ACLU and other NGOs, we have many reunited, but not all, and some unethical. I think I'm also concerned ethically when it comes to detention and the detention of children, but also for-profit detention, of the financial stakes in maintaining this broken system. I think that was the last thing I wanted to put on the table. So we've seen after the recent election, the stocks for GEO and Corrections Corporation of America go up over 100% due to Trump's avowed pledge to increase detention. We see these tents now at capacity, they're having to expand them. So I think the idea that there might be profit or incentive in detaining more folks, especially if they may be credible asylum seekers, to get back to your original distinctions, is another moral concern I wanted to put on the table.
So, Kurt Vonnegut once said that human beings were invented by water as a way to transport itself more efficiently from one place to another. And I think law was invented by human beings as a way to grapple with complicated ethical, political questions in a moderately pragmatic way. I think that international law has done a passably good job at answering this question. If we were having this conversation in 1952, I would not be so optimistic about that, because at that point we basically had this binary differentiation between refugees and migrants. And the refugee, I guess somebody should say it just for the benefit of students who are here, is a highly technical legal concept that says a refugee is a person who can demonstrate a well-founded fear of persecution, but only on one of 5 very specific grounds: race, religion, national origin, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group, which is a very vague concept and one about which Jefferson Beauregard Sessions III has recently been opining in ways that I think are incorrect. But the law does say that we can distinguish, based on various factors, the ethical and therefore the legal responsibility of a particular nation state to actually provisionally admit a person, give them a measure of what we in the United States call due process, but in other legal cultures we go by different names, and determine if they would face torture. So we have a convention against torture. If they would starve. Climate refugees are a work in progress, but there are norms that are developing. Now, implementing those norms is a different question, but I do think that law captures passably well and in a dynamic, evolving way that I actually find very enlightening, a discursive way, this question. The problem, of course, is that nation states vary tremendously in how well they're complying with it, and they also vary tremendously in their own national mythologies about how they understand their community, how they understand power. So why did I say I believe in borders? I mean, I'll just cite Tibet as an example. If the government of China suddenly said, we're going to induce 100 million people to migrate into Tibet, I would say no, that Tibet needs to be able to enforce its borders. So there are certain presumptively legitimate exercises of state power at the border that I think we'd all agree were important. But the question of how do we differentiate those who have a legitimate claim for some protection from those who do not, that's the hardest question. Part of that answer is process. Part of it is an evolving idea of substance that transcends the refugee category. And again, we can talk more about the details.
Yeah, well, from my perspective, there's a lot of things on the table here. I guess I want to go back a bit to what Hosffman was alluding to. And this observed proclivity to opt for wealthy migrants as opposed to more needy ones. Well, you know, it strikes me that this is a question of like most things, I guess, a question of perspective and who is the we we're talking about. Because while one could see that, you know, we might prefer, might move in a direction of, like Canada, of choosing more, what we perceive as more contributing, more easily assimilated migrants. We have opted in a different direction, but I think the we here is highly problematic. It always strikes me that for the same reasons that many Americans may resist poor, socially marginal, or otherwise dependent or potentially dependent populations coming in, is precisely the reason why many other Americans want them here. And we never ever talk about the class interest involved in prevailing immigration policy. We talk about businesses, and that's usually in, you know, skeptical, negative terms. But we never talk about, you know, the good people of Newton, of which I'm one, who, you know, or this university, who relies a lot on immigrant labor. You know, that's a big factor here, and it's not very often acknowledged. And my interpretation of the current political situation we're in, and how we wind up with a Donald Trump, and this is a response in part to what Dan was saying earlier, is a reflection of this unacknowledged class interest of many of our political, academic, and policy elites. They don't understand why so many people in America are so upset about prevailing immigration policy. I was once at a session with Doris Meisner, the former head of the Immigration and Naturalization Service under Obama for 8 years, probably the best INS commissioner we've ever had, very knowledgeable, very decent woman, who argued that most Americans will understand that these immigrants, you know, wait on the tables at the restaurants and paint their houses and cut their lawns and do all these other sorts of things that Americans apparently don't do for themselves. Well, on that occasion, I had news for Doris Meisner, and I would make the same point now. Most Americans don't pay to have those things done. Most Americans do them themselves or can't afford to have them done. And that reflects the political problem that we're up against right now, that we've got a policy in this case, I would argue, and in many other domains, that reflects a very narrow view of the world by a very privileged elite set of policymakers, academics, and their brethren. And all the reactions to the kind of migration we've had on the part of lots of Americans isn't always expressed very well. There's animosity behind it, there's hatred, there's racism. But to sum it up merely to that, and to not acknowledge that there's some real legitimacy and rational concerns behind many, many Americans who, you know, don't really like hearing that they're part of an ever-diminishing, formerly white majority, soon to be white minority. I would ask you, what society would welcome such news? None that I'm aware of. The irony being, of course, that it's not even clear that we're becoming a majority-minority society, given that most Hispanics claim to be white, and by the third generation, they're intermarrying with white Americans. So it's not even clear that it's true, but if you wanted a slogan to drive lots of people really wacky and voting for somebody like Donald Trump, that's it.
Let us say in the hypothetical case that you had a philosophy, theology, political science, law student who's writing a 10-page paper on 3 things that can be done to ethically address the border issues in our country. What would you say? A tripartite paper. What would the 3 parts? Kristin, we'll go with you.
Okay, part 1.
Notice how we're going to take this down.
Part 1.
These are my immigration laws.
Is that it?
The ones I'm taking
I
notes.
do have Penny's voice, I'm not a law professor. I really do think, even though I agree it's not completely new, challenging the diversionary rhetoric, the kind of bait and switch that we've been talking about here. Some of it has become really dangerous under Trump, but I think some of these scripts that actually several of the last comments are making more complex need to be challenged. So we unmasking diversionary rhetoric that's harmful in terms of all immigrants are just takers, all immigrants are security threats, right? I think even though we've always reinvented the outsider as a social menace in moments of national crisis, and it serves us, I think it's not the full picture. And so challenging the operative narrative would be part one. I think part two would be legislative. I mean, I really do think that there are some innovations that Trump is trying to implement. I mean, even some to legal immigration in terms of priorities you were just talking about. In a way, focusing on symptoms rather than problems also is passing the buck in terms of congressional inaction. I don't think it should just be the judiciary taking this up, or we shouldn't just be focusing at the border. Shouldn't just be a political football, but we need to do the hard work of bipartisan comprehensive reform. I would roll back some of the problematic things that I just said Trump has implemented myself. Because I also think they've had a chilling effect. I think the reason some parents are afraid to come forward to claim these separated children is they have to then also give forth their information. Maybe of people not showing up for doctor's appointments with this wider latitude. I think public safety, public health is suffering. But I think the third point, the third part of your paper would be Peter's last point in my mind. I don't think we can bypass efforts to rebuild public trust around some of these underlying issues that you're naming. I think in some cases there's misinformation and faulty rhetoric that make people feel threatened, and in some cases there's real senses of economic suffering, there's real senses of class differences you've mentioned, there's real senses of anxiety about change, and I don't think we can completely bypass that to addressing this in a lasting way. By way of a little plug, but it's related to the question, in November for International Education Week, we're bringing in Ali Marani, who wrote this book, There Goes the Neighborhood. And he was this immigration rights activist who was really confused about why legislative change wasn't effective. He said, we really thought that we needed to use data to change minds. And he said, what we failed to realize is that our country was having a debate about identity and about who we are as a nation. So he actually did, like, to go back to the having a beer with Border Patrol and with folks in Guatemala, right? Like, he went and talked to sheriffs in Utah. He talked to peach farmers in Georgia. You know, he just really wanted to figure out how are we talking past one another in this country. So for me, that would be the third element of the Trump paper.
Anybody else want to weigh in on the tripartite paper here?
I was going to add one more piece, but this may be just from thinking about law students. But it is to take law seriously, and not only as a binary concept, not as an on-off switch, what part of illegal do you not understand, but law as a repository of values discourse and a way to grapple with some of these more complicated questions in terms of who has quote-unquote a right to be here and who doesn't. And I think looking at law in that way also helps to disaggregate the points that Peter was making. I don't think the class argument and the race argument ought to be conflated at all. I think they're completely different and need to be discussed in completely different terms. In terms of a class argument, I'm perfectly comfortable saying to poor people in this country, and I until fairly recently in my life was one of them and was raised by them, so I feel like I sort of know what a working class life is like for various reasons. And in fact, I was raised in an interracial family, or whatever that's worth. But I think I can have that conversation about it. If you really think that the Mexican worker who's cutting the grass is more of a threat to you than the billionaire who's been sucking the life out of the economy, let's talk about that. I mean, I think we can have a rational discussion about that. The history of immigration policy in this country has always used class, anxiety as a cudgel, sometimes for legitimate purposes, union protection and fighting the exploitation of immigrant workers. That is very important, and there has been exploitation, there's no doubt about it. It's an important question. But it's also channeled some very negative things. On the racial thing, the white anxiety, there I have more trouble actually saying anything other than, get over it, or let's look at history and see that race has always been more fluid and dynamic. I realize that's not going to be of much comfort to people who feel that way, but I feel like I'd want to try to convince them that that position is just wrong. So I put that in the paper too.
So the final line in the paper should be, just get over it.
I'm not sure I need to edit it.
Okay, good.
Actually, I'm thinking of your example of the paper from the perspective of theology, practical theology. I mean, when one looks at the Catholic Church, in itself is a microcosm of the United States, and many of the questions that we have wrestled with at the political level, we're wrestling with them in the church, I mean, a church that 50, 60 years ago was 90% white, today about half of the Catholic population in this country is white, so, and then the Latino population went from 7% to about 43% in 50 years. So we're wrestling with who belongs to where, and I'm thinking that if for a paper addressing these dynamics, what I would suggest is the first part, look at the history. I think that the historical piece, how did we get here, because I think that's important to understand the trajectory. Second, I would say, and this is, again, from a pastoral perspective, how do you listen to people's stories and perspectives? I think that what you have done, going to the border, listening to these border patrol officers, listening to the immigrants, I do this in the context of faith communities. That has transformed my own experience. But frankly, we're privileged because we're researchers. We get the chance to spend time with them. Most people do not have that chance, But if we invite people to actually do it, I think it changes. And finally, I think that the conclusion of a paper like this needs to really focus on the question of what's the common good. What's the common good, both nationally and internationally. I'm thinking, for instance, how do we assume responsibility for what's happening? I mean, how do we, in the United States of America, assume responsibility for what's happening in Central America, for instance, and whether socially, politically, economically, and I think that we need to have those conversations as well.
I want to hear from you folks now. Why don't we start with Eric here in the first row, my distinguished predecessor here. Because you were you're a social ethics, you're the director of the International Studies program here at DC.
Well, thanks, Mark. I appreciate it. I admire and respect you all, and especially your expertise in this area, and I appreciate you being here. Thanks for this panel. It's such an important conversation. I guess the things that come to mind, one is asking historically, since you all studied this and know the history of it, has the cultural threat that's posed, has the immigration as a cultural threat been as persistent a theme as the immigration as security threat has become today? I wonder, as a dialectic, I know that there have been times in American history when we speak of the other Germans or Japanese in the 20th century, but many others as well as a securitized threat. But I wonder, it seems to me that there's an interesting relationship between those two that we're hearing from Trump. The shutdown of refugee flow as a security threat, and the shutdown of the southern border as a cultural threat, probably sometimes security as well. So I'd love to hear a little reflection on that as a theme, and what I would need to know to understand it better.
You want to start?
The two things have always been intertwined to the point where it's very hard to separate them out. As you were talking, I was thinking of, I was just talking to my students about the Alien and Sedition Act in 1798. A big part of what the New England Federalists were concerned about during that period, and just for those who don't remember this, this was a couple of laws that were passed by, mostly in the John Adams administration, aimed at French and Irish people who were deemed to be threats for a number of reasons. And some of the reasons were national security-based threats. There have been worries that the French were subverting some of the Anglophile goals, and so in the Irish too. But some of them were cultural, that they just didn't like French people, and Ben Franklin wrote about Germans, that they're beyond the pale. There's no way they could ever assimilate. They're, subhumans, essentially. And then when you look to the early 20th century and the Palmer raids and the concerns about anarchists and socialists, part of that was ideological, part of it was a threat, and part of it was cultural. Part of it was that they were Jews or they were coming from Eastern Europe. And when you look at the exclusion of the Chinese, the Supreme Court channeling some very racist discourse about people who have heathenish souls. The New York Times said they have heathenish souls and heathenish propensities, but the Supreme Court said the threat matters not if it comes from armies or vast hordes of their people crowding in on us. That our very culture is at issue. I think that's part of what makes immigration policy always such a fascinating subject, because you feel like, I feel like the national security threat, if it's real, is completely legitimate. This is why we vote for governments. This is why I support the nation state. I do believe in borders for that reason. But that's a big if. The cultural threat could be legitimate, but is a much more complex conversation that I need to have with somebody who says our culture is under threat. And this is because our culture is that of being a nation of immigrants. That is, I think, the best version of our culture in this country. Now, if we were having this conversation in Germany, it would be a very different thing. I once wrote an article making the point that if in the US the government is really harsh on immigrants, people say, you can't do that, it's un-American, it violates our best traditions. If the German government does that, Germans don't say you can't do that, it's un-German. They say you shouldn't do that, it's too German. Like, this is dangerous. So that's a very different cultural background, right? So I think in order to answer that question, we need to have a more nuanced conversation. Now, what do I think is happening now? I mean, I think the travel ban was a classic example of the conflation of those two discourses in a way that was very problematic. And of course, what Trump has said about Mexicans, rapists and all that. So I can't answer the question about separating the two things.
Yeah, I guess I would agree with many of the things Dan just said. At least I think so.
You all heard it here first.
But I'll grab onto a couple of them. First of all, it is important to underscore that the security threats that have been experienced in American history up to and including 9/11 were real. I mean, 9/11 did happen. It was effectuated by Muslims. The Palmer raids, which I learned about when I was a neo-Marxist as an undergraduate, or should I say aspiring neo-Marxist, I never made the grade.
We had many discussions about whether to let you in or not.
I'm not sure you were there.
No.
I think. Yeah. Okay. So I was trying to figure out where you were, but I. The Palmer raids, of course, were effectuated by Attorney General Palmer, who was Woodrow Wilson's Attorney General, and hundreds, if not thousands, of anarchists and early communists were expelled from the country, including Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman and so forth, and without even the vaguest notion of any kind of due process. But it is worth pointing out that the Palmer raids were a response to the fact that anarchists bombed Attorney General Palmer's house 2 blocks from DuPont Circle, a fact that I'm somewhat embarrassed, but not completely embarrassed to say that I only figured out about 10 years ago, because that never quite surfaced. So these things are real, but what we do with them is something else. And I am struck that, for example, how Muslims figure into our current debates over security obviously Donald Trump, once again, is no one to, I'm not going to endorse any of his policies on that front. But I would say that the kind of discourse that we have gotten about these developments in the previous administration have not been helpful. When students of mine will recognize this, I'm not sure the rest of you will remember it, but we had some really unenlightening and embarrassing colloquies between Congressman Lamar Smith, a Republican from San Antonio, and Attorney General Holder over whether or not radical Islamic terrorists were responsible for 9/11 and whether radical Islamic terrorists continued to be a threat to the United States. And for 20 minutes, Congressman Smith bore down on the Attorney General, trying to get him to say that to utter the words radical Islamic terrorism in one sentence or one phrase. And under no circumstances would Attorney General Holder ever do that, because of course that was the administration's line, that we're not battling radical Islamic terrorism, we're not battling Islamic terrorism, we're battling terrorism, too cool. Well, I don't think that's a very helpful perspective. I don't think that's a very helpful discourse. It makes people feel like there's, like their elites don't understand what's been going on. It gives them the feeling that their elites are redefining the language, I'm very sure has helped lay the groundwork for, once again, for Donald Trump. Large numbers of Americans feel like there's just an inability and an unwillingness on the part of our political elites to be straightforward and talk about the concerns that they have in any kind of real language. So many games are played with language that we're reaping the sad rewards of that right now, I would argue.
But let me just, in the Palmer raids, Mitchell Palmer, by the way, had political aspirations and referred to himself as the fighting Quaker. And his critics on the right referred to him as the quaking fighter. So there was a very tough time. It would have made a big difference if he and his protege, J. Edgar Hoover, had said not what they did say, which is we're going after anarchists and socialists, but if they had said we're going after Jews or Jewish rootless cosmopolitans or something like that, it would have made a big difference. So I take your point about the discourse today, but I do think that language matters in this, and one needs to be careful about identifying the various strains of what it is we're talking about. So.
Yeah, but it does matter, but look, you give them too much credit. If Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman had been fighting in the name of Judaism or radical Judaism, they would have been denounced as Jews, as Jewish radicals. But they were fighting in the name of communism. And the 9/11 was effectuated by people who were doing so in the name of radical Islamic terrorism or radical Islamism. There seems to me that they're two very different circumstances and two very different dynamics.
Other questions here? We've been cowed and something. Yes, sir.
Just one point. You described our nation as, above all, characterized as a nation of immigrants. But on the whole, immigrants had to change to become Americans. So what is it? There is a kind of culture of the country, whether you call it culture of self-reliance, a culture of the rights of man, a culture of democracy. Whichever you call it, it's a certain way of life. And ways of life, as well as security in the elemental sense of one's bodily security, may need to be defended, or at least encouraged. So it seems to me there's something to be said for sobriety about admitting people to the country, especially if it's a huge political issue of great controversy. just ignoring that. And using language, as Peter said, not calling illegal immigrants illegal, but calling them undocumented, shows a kind of cowardice or a kind of hiding the truth, which perhaps leads, once again, to a kind of Trumpian reaction.
Well, now you said three separate things that I would want to respond to separately. One is the legitimacy of a political cultural community, and I actually do agree that that is legitimate, and I do agree that it is potentially legitimate to fight to preserve that. The legitimacy of fighting to preserve that depends upon how one assesses the nature of the threat. And this has to be a substantive conversation, because if you were to say to me, we ought to really think long and hard about allowing Nazis to immigrate to the United States, I would say, yeah, I think we ought to think long and hard about that. Now let's think about that in the context of our understanding of the First Amendment, in the context of our understanding about discourse, in our context of our understanding about the relationship between citizen rights and human rights. Would I ban somebody simply because they've articulated that? Probably not. Would I ban somebody if there was evidence that they were actively plotting a National Socialist revolution? Probably. Would I exclude people if there was some evidence that they were likely? You know, it's a question of what's the burden of proof. I'm thinking of the 9/11 people. But would I exclude people because they are Muslim? Absolutely not. So it's a question of degree. This is what I meant about taking law seriously. Law has mechanisms for making these kind of judgment calls. That's what we call due process. That's what some people call vetting, but you know, it depends on how you do it. As far as the undocumented non-citizen versus the illegal alien, you know, again, we shouldn't pretend that language doesn't have, this is coded discourse at this point. So I can defend the proposition, and I will right now, that using the term illegal alien is inappropriate as a matter of law. We don't normally use the adjectival epithet of illegality to apply to the existential person. We normally use it to describe conduct. And even before we do that, we normally expect some level of process, like a criminal trial or a civil trial or something, before I'm ready to say that your conduct was wrong. But to say that you, in your very body, is illegal is a stretch, because the person has violated a law. But so have I. I mean, so has everybody who's taken a home office deduction. I'm not saying that was me, but thinking about it carefully.
That part of the table.
Right, no, I'm not saying me, but I'm saying there's a million violations of law that people engage in every day. That doesn't make me illegal. The term alien is a term of art in the immigration statutes. That's true. But it also has a peculiarly pejorative resonance for a lot of people, so we could debate whether that's an appropriate term. I tend to think undocumented, or in France they now use the term sans-papier, something like that, captures it better, but it's a conversation we could have. I think that this question is a conversation starter, not a conversation stopper. I don't think it's cowardly, though you use the word cowardly. I would bridle at that. I think that it is part of, it's a proxy for a discourse about a lot of other things, which requires a more complicated conversation. I forgot what the third part of which is, I guess. But
That was the most important part.
Oh, I'm sorry. Maybe I agree with it.
Thank you all for the many perspectives, and my head is just spinning with all the questions and ideas, and I hope I can be articulate with my questions. I'm particularly troubled when children are taken away from families at the border. So my question, I have two. I'm trying to understand the place of the rights of the child in immigration policy and law in the US, that's one, because I don't really know a lot about that. Two, I come from across the street from the School of Theology and Ministry, so my question is also theological. How might we theologically respond to what I call to be the social suffering of migrant children as children? Because as I think about human dignity, it sounds to me sometimes the language of human dignity doesn't really include the lives of children or not. And I think this has really broad implications for how we understand the place of children in terms of justice as church today. So how might the situation of child migrants in this particular case push theological ethics? Really think on how we can and we need to formulate a social ethics on children as children to protect and to engage their participation as agents.
So why don't we start on that end? So the theologs are on that end, okay?
Sure, thank you for both questions. On the second question, I really appreciate your concern that there's something more than just a violation of human dignity. I think in secular analyses you hear concerns about children's relative culpability, or maybe they don't even fully comprehend, maybe they were brought as children. I tend to resist diagnoses and solutions that would pit innocent children against guilty parents, probably for reasons that are clear. But I agree with you that there's a thicker tradition in Christian ethics that we could draw upon than the important but thin universal human dignity that crosses borders. I think the family in Christian ethics occupies a pretty important place, right? The family is sacred, the family is social. We talk in terms of a school of deeper humanity. We talk in terms of a domestic church even. But I think central to the integral family humanism in the Catholic tradition is this connection between the importance of our relationality, right? To be relational is so integral to what it is to be human, that it's to be a toddler ripped from a parent's arms or a mother unable to parent violates her very subjectivity. It's not just regrettable or a sad story that then we switch to the next news station. But it's really kind of a violation of that relationality and subjectivity. But I also think the integral family humanism yokes that, it's not just a kind of a safe haven away from the harsh world, to a social responsibility. So that's where I think like Hosffman was connecting the common good at the end. I think the connection in Christian family ethics of the family's role to the common good brings into sharper relief the ways in which detention in cage-like situations or prolonged, protracted family separation, which happened long before this summer through some of our policies, right, really harms not only human dignity, but also the common good. They're unable to kind of participate in this envisioned way. I had a fourth point, but it's gone. I think that maybe the fourth point was your focus on the agency of the children so that we avoid kind of a paternalistic or a pity-based response. You know, Alan Kurdi washed up on the shores and people couldn't believe this, and yet we've kind of moved on from that news cycle. We hear the audio of children over the summer, and yet there's still separation and the slowness of response. We've kind of moved beyond that. But if we think about children as agents and not objects of pity, I think that moves us to a more robust sense of responsibility.
By the way, the last two countries to ratify the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the United States and Somalia, and I believe Somalia just ratified it.
I just want to echo the aspect of which I find problematic, you know, the objectification of the child, you know, particularly because it somehow gives way to governments or to others to simply say, you know, to take a child away from his or her family and say the government has a right to give the child an adoption or to keep it in a detention center and so forth. And I think that your question, Alfred, calls for a conversation on the rights of the child as a citizen, the rights of the child as an agent, you know, as a human being, and how those rights of the child, you know, play vis-a-vis the adult, you know, the family, the government, and so forth. And I think that in the process of migration, crossing borders, you know, that really gets lost. So it really calls for a major conversation.
Peter?
Yeah, I just wanted to raise a point. It's not directly responsive to the question, but it emerges from this, is that all of these conversations conversations, including the conversations of which I'm a part or the instigator, are all premised on the presumed rights, prerogatives, or lack thereof of people to come from one country to another. But particularly when we're talking about family and family integrity, why don't we talk more, why don't the Catholic bishops talk more about something more like the right to stay home, the right to raise your family in the culture in which you were raised and which presumably you value. To me, there's somewhat of a stacked deck here. I think the Catholic Church has a lot of reckoning to do. That's an understatement in the current environment. And one of those things, though, is I would be hard-pressed, I am hard-pressed to tell students that there isn't some level of self-interest in the Catholic Church's position in the United States on immigration. These are new bodies to fill the pews at a time when the church is in desperate shape. It would defy human understanding not to think that that's not part of the rationale, conscious or unconscious, of the church's position on immigration. I say that with respect. I'm not impugning anyone's motives. I mean, human nature is human nature. Institutions have their
There's an old theological phrase for this. It's called original sin. You're on safe ground.
Okay. But it does strike me that we all start from the presumption that, people are going to come here, they ought to be allowed to come here, and very little attention to maybe the family and its integrity and the welfare of the individuals therein would be much better served if people were not, drawn into this maelstrom of turmoil and horror that migration is for so many people. I do wish the bishops would spend more time talking about that, and I am mindful, I would be welcome to be corrected or informed better, but to my knowledge, the bishops in Ireland have entertained these kinds of themes at various points when they felt that the lifeblood of the church, of the young people, was flowing out to America and Australia. They talked about the right to stay home. Why don't we talk more about that with regard to turmoil in Central America, for which we have responsibility? I have no doubt about that. And I'm not trying to change the subject, but it seems to me that's worth talking about.
I'll pass that along to Cardinal Law.
Or Cardinal Law is all the better, that's fine. I would just say that the Mexican and U.S. bishops' joint document, Strangers No Longer, it's 15 years old now, 13 years old, but it's the most recent document on this. Comprehensive, does talk about the right not to have to migrate, so the right to remain pretty explicitly. And it grounds in universal human dignity, the right to life and all those things necessary to lead a dignified life for your family. So the right to be able to feed yourself and your family. And then it kind of goes on from there to talk about the rights to migration when that can't be fulfilled in one's homeland. I would agree that that document is not very well known, but also departs from mostly what they're doing in a reactive mode, whether on Capitol Hill or whether on preaching priorities. So I would say that the concern remains. I think in some respects, some ecclesial documents take outdated migration theories into account when they're formulating a response, in my view. So that also contributes to where their emphases may lie. But I just did want to say that also in the U.S. and Mexican states, there's an emphasis on the right not to have to migrate.
Yeah.
I would also say, apart from the bishop's question or the church question, there's a very interesting emerging literature in the social sciences globally, particularly in Europe, about this question of the optimal relationship between development policies and migration control and so forth. Some of it I think is quite good, some of it I think is somewhat pernicious, but I think that if you were implying that people aren't talking about this, I think it's most conferences that I go to, it's been sort of a central theme in sociology and in international law and a number of fields. So I think that, I mean, Alexander Betzberg, somebody mentioned Betz before. I don't actually like a lot of his work, but I think that there's a lot of people at Oxford who have really been working through those questions in Africa and elsewhere.
Kristin, you had a question? No?
Yeah.
Okay.
So here's the German.
Erst kommt
I
das
know
Fressen,
already
dann kommt die Moral.
I know already that that statement is wrong because I wouldn't self-identify as German. And this is an interesting question because you started off, Mark, with the question, do states need borders? And you all said, yeah, the nation state. And I think that was a little too quick for my liking because what about the permeability of borders? So, the European Union has some experience with opening borders, and I don't mean the current refugee situation, I mean 2004, when European borders towards the east opened, and we welcomed more states into the European Union. And we had these fears, people will come over into our social systems and will, we'll have welfare scroungers at our doorstep. People didn't do that. People moved back and forth between where they live and between where work opportunities opened up, but later on they also started businesses in their home countries. So what I see in this debate, and here I'm wondering, are you really that pro black and white, in or out? What I see in your debate is you think that people want to come to the United States, so that the shining beacon, the place where we all want to welcome everyone and everyone wants to stay there. But what about, you talked about the history of the border, and you're all aware of that back and forth migration that happened. So what about that? What about that? And on a side note, actually, I want to come in on the bishops having an interest in filling the ranks. They're very strong in Europe about undocumented migration, and the majority of undocumented migrants is not Catholic. So, at least from my perspective, I can say it doesn't really help the church in terms of numbers. It's more a question of, as a church, we are part of a culture, and what kind of culture do we want to live in?
Peter?
Yeah, on the last point about I wasn't reducing the church's motives just to that.
Yeah.
Although, as a political scientist, when you mention the churches in Europe, I mean, I know something about the church in Germany. I know how it relies on church taxes. I want to ask some questions about whether the church or churches in Germany get subvented by the state in addition to what they normally get in order to settle refugees, perhaps. Again, well, I'd like to know more, but again, I wouldn't want to reduce it just to that. I think that would be unfair and foolish, but I'm just saying it's a factor. You're absolutely right about the presumption of much of these conversations in America. I've always been struck that the movie Brooklyn, which many of you may have seen, which is about an Irish woman who comes to Brooklyn, doesn't really want to come, gets talking to coming here by her older sister. She's coming for a temporary stay. That was the idea. She didn't really want to stay. She gets really drawn into going back home. Her mother dies. She goes back home, but before she goes back home, she meets this Italian guy, working class plumber, son of immigrants, and they get married kind of secretly. And she goes back to Ireland to bury her sister actually, and to tend to her mother. Gets involved with some other guy in Ireland and is very tempted to stay in Ireland and sort of forget her husband and left back in Brooklyn, and then realizes she's pregnant. So she has to go back to Brooklyn and disengages from Ireland, and thus winds up settling in the US. But you know, that's a very common story of people coming here not intending to stay and going back and forth, back and forth. That's what Italians did in large numbers at the turn of the last century. Most people from Mexico have come here under that assumption, or large numbers of them have, and we have a hard time understanding that. The point about the movie Brooklyn is that it's not made by Americans, it's made by Canadians, Germans, I think, and one other country, but it's not made by Americans. Americans would make a very different kind of movie. So you're right, we do presume all these things, but it's also true that people wind up staying in large numbers, either because they're seduced by life here, or they're not seduced, they have kids, and life goes on, and they still talk about going home, but wind up staying here. So these things are motives are very hard to suss out, there's no doubt about it. And we make pretty crass assumptions that given things being equal, anybody in their right mind will move to America. That's very flattering, but it's not true.
Dan?
I think I've known many people who have come here, immigrants, clients, relatives, family, who have come for purely economic reasons. I know many who have come because they were pregnant, or for purely personal reasons, or because they were fleeing a bad marriage or domestic violence. I've also known people who have come because they actually aspire to be part of this particular community, this community of what they perceive to be democracy and a certain idea of the rule of law. So I agree, I think people's motives are complicated. I was going to mention Angela Merkel in regard to this conversation, because I think she stands as a very interesting historical figure for a lot of reasons, given that she's German, among others, but also that she in many ways became the voice of a certain ideal of the European Union and a certain ideal of refugee law and humanitarian law. I always thought it was quite interesting that, to the best of my knowledge, she almost never did it in grandly ideological terms. It was always more, what you say, ganz praktisch, that we can manage, we can handle it. But I think implicit in that was a particular idea of the best angels of the German tradition. And I think in Germany, as much as in the United States, there's been a debate, between what these two ideals are. She has suffered for that politically. And I think that's an important question that people often ask, that Peter usually raises, and I think it's a legitimate good question. At what point does pro-immigrant activism and openness and humanitarianism predictably lead to reactionary politics? I think that's something we haven't discussed much, because that's a more practical conversation, but I think you're seeing that in Europe now, that struggle as well.
As is always the case with these kind of things, when you get smart people, we have more questions than we have time. We are out of time, but please join me in thanking these wonderful